Can you hear me? Is my video, is the voice loud enough?
Yeah, we
Yeah.
can hear.
Okay. I'm not very technical, so that's why I have to check. So my name is Wendy Yee. My father and his siblings, they were all born and raised in Seattle. And my grandfather also came to America as a young man to join his father, which is my great grandfather. So I'll go more into that in a little bit. But I was really impressed reading the flashcards of all the different information that you young people were able to discover. So when I was in high school, we used to, I lived in Los Angeles and we came almost every summer for vacation to visit my grandparents. And because sometimes it wasn't, the most interesting days, when I was old enough, I would go to Seattle Public Library and I started researching my family roots. But before I do that, it's like Providence had planned that the Chinese would be available to immigrate. So in 1750 is when the Chinese were captured and taken to South America as slaves, and they were treated so miserably that in 1850, China government banned that slave trade to South America. And then around that time is when they developed a coolie contract system to America. So profitable business was to send starving peasants overseas and, contract them out for labor. But China's agriculture, was very dependent on weather and other elements. But many of the areas, China is a big land, but many areas are too hilly or rocky to grow much agriculture. So the amount of natural crops was only enough to feed about 1/3 of the population of the nation. And back in those imperial dynasty days, you paid your taxes with grain. So like you had to ship your rice to Beijing. So when Meiguo, beautiful country, started to be advertised, of course, it was sold as streets of gold, and you just could pick up those pieces and immediately be rich. But what greeted the immigrants is long hours, grueling conditions, and little pay. So like the railroad workers earned about $1 a day. Now you have to look back at that time, might have been an acceptable wage, except that the white Irish workers earned 3 times as much. So the Chinese were very little step above slave labor. So 1850 is also the time that gold was discovered, but most of the Chinese immigrants, when they came to America, they weren't allowed to buy a plot of land. That's what the miners did. So they had jobs like operating the mining camps with the laundries, stores, barbershop, gambling houses. And yeah, gambling would not be my thing to promote, except this is only men that were able to come over. And so what else were they going to do during their, relaxation time? But then the gold started to dwindle down and there wasn't as much to choose from. Now, the Chinese were able to get the leftover mining plots, and they would work very diligently and sometimes got a little bit of gold dust, not a lot, but it was enough to cause jealousy among the whites that were there, because that was probably their plot and they didn't find any more gold. But the Chinese worked it so thoroughly that they were able to get some. They didn't get rich, but they were able to get some gold dust. So what were they going to do? They're in a foreign country and they need to earn a living. So many cooks, many Chinese, I mean, they became cooks in the lumber camps. And it was known back in the late 1800s, if you wanted to work for a lumber company, go to the one that had a Chinese cook, because you would eat better food. And then also the Chinese would help build the logging roads, because that's when they started cutting down trees, shipping them. Many became gardeners or domestic servants for the wealthy. And then a big number were contracted to the railroads. So now the Chinese started, if they entered into San Francisco, they would start with the Central Pacific Railroad, which was built eastward towards the connecting point in Utah. The east side of the railroad business was Union Pacific, that built towards the west into Utah. So when my great-grandfather came to the United States in 1877, he was 14 years old. I know a lot of you kids are high school age. Would you really want the adventure of traveling overseas to a foreign country where you knew not a single person, you didn't speak the language, but that's the chance you took. And also, your parents would depend on you to send money back. They didn't know that $1 a day didn't go very far, but the Chinese would not waste their money so that they could still send money home to their family. So as a 14-year-old, my great-grandfather had the job as a water boy. And you've probably seen pictures with the big long poles, and Chinese would carry big buckets and baskets, heavy burdens as they walked along. Well, what these boys, because they worked like men, but they were really boys, they were lugging boiled water in which they used to make tea up the mountains to the workers. And maybe you think nowadays that's not such a big thing, but because the Chinese insisted on having their tea and boiled water, they weren't afflicted with all the diseases that many other railroad camps suffered. And you have to remember, most Chinese, especially the Cantonese, where many of the workers came, because it's close to a port city, but we're small in build. I was born and raised in the US, and I'm only 5 feet tall. I thought I should have had a chance to be taller, but I never was. So generally, Chinese stature is quite small, especially in comparison to the Caucasians. Yet they were able to accomplish amazing work, and they worked faster on the Central Pacific side than the Union people. So when the Transcontinental Railroad was complete in Promontory Point, Utah, then where are all these workers supposed to go? They still need to eat and have a place to live, but they're in the middle of nowhere. So many Chinese worked at different construction sites, or they worked their way up to the north, where now being built was the Northern Pacific Railroad from Midwest out to Seattle. So by 1897, Ah King is my grandfather's English name, great-grandfather's English name, he became a merchant in Spokane. It was the Yee company. Now, before that, he had planned on this store. And so in 1893, he traveled back to China to purchase goods for the Spokane store. So the port of entry at that time was Port Townsend. And so can you imagine all these goods had to be transported by mule trains from Port Townsend to Spokane. Now, today you can hop in the car from Seattle and get there in about 5 or 6 hours. So just things took a lot longer back then. And he partnered with YUN Company and really helped to build up the availability of products for the many Chinese that came to Washington. In 1906, Ah-King established the Ah-King Company in Seattle. So he, meanwhile, moved west because so many Chinese were coming into Seattle. And the store that he had was King Chung Lung, which means fierce golden dragon. It is in the site of the original the second Chinatown, which got rebuilt in 1913 because I think it was flooding from Puget Sound. So his store would carry the comfort foods back from home, herbs and things like that you would naturally miss if you were a foreigner in a strange land. And not only that, he really wanted to help his fellow Chinese. He became an employment broker for the new immigrants. He also brought in wholesale goods that got shipped like to Spokane and other stores across the country. He provided temporary housing for the many immigrants as they transitioned to jobs, or they shipped out to Alaska canneries, which became a big stable business, or maybe they were waiting for a ship to sail back to China. So he was actually quite clever because he paid his workers with Ah-King coins. And we were able to discover that in the basement of my grandparents' house that was on Beacon Hill. And there were quite a few coins left. So he paid the workers with these Ah-King coins that they couldn't use anywhere else except at the Alaska cannery stores. And that was to protect them from robbery. And also it guaranteed them payment in US dollars when they came back to Seattle. So it worked both ways. It protected the workers, but it also kept the money in the company, which I think is quite savvy business knowledge for only completing middle school in China. And Ah-King was also involved in politics. His nickname was the mayor of Chinatown. There were 5 main families in the early 1900s that helped to build the Chinatown back then. My great-grandfather was one of them. But then on a national level, I don't know how he got to know Woodrow Wilson, who was inaugurated as president of the United States in 1913. But Ah-King also would write letters to newspapers because by this time, 1913, already the 1882 Exclusion Act was in effect. So he would write articles to try to moderate some of those policies. And then in 1915, tragically, my great-grandfather was found dead in a Sacramento hotel room. The newspapers, because actually I am crazy enough to go back and look for those articles back in 1915, and the different newspapers could not agree on motive or if it was murder or suicide or who possibly could have done it. But I think what was so amazing, at the turn of the century, basically, the newspaper even recorded that there were 3,000 Seattleites that attended my great-grandfather's funeral. It was presided by the Reverend Matthews. I think he was the First Presbyterian Church of Seattle. And the funeral cortege actually had 2 American bands and 1 Chinese band. So that's really amazing to me, that for Americans not liking Chinese, that they have still accorded my great-grandfather, a great honor. Now, by 1915, Ah King had procured passage for his son. Okay, so I should backtrack. When he went back for that buying trip for his store in 1893, the family also had found him a wife, so he married in China, had a son there. But at that time, with the Exclusion Act, families were not allowed to accompany the workers. Only the workers could enter the country. So imagine that he never saw his son, and my grandfather never knew his father. And by the time his father arranged passage, he was already 19 years old and married and had a child. Now, the Exclusion Act stipulated merchants was an acceptable labor designation. So in 1980, the Department of Labor and Immigration Service changed its status from student to Chinese merchant. And that allowed my grandfather to return to China and bring back his wife. And this is a big thing because merchants were profitable to Seattle and to Washington. So then they made an exception that merchants could bring their families over here. So as part of his, my great-grandfather's developing Chinatown, he made sure that, he protected these immigrants from the discrimination. He tried to introduce them to different people so that they would have a sense of belonging. And most of the laborers at that time, their goal is to save up enough money to return to their homeland. It didn't really happen that way. Although with my great-grandfather's funeral, they did arrange to ship his body back to China. In 2013, I was able to go back to my ancestral village, and the relatives there actually showed me his burial plot. And it was just like, wow, I feel like I just traveled back 200 years in time. It was pretty incredible. And in 1905, Seattle built the Chinese Imperial School. And my great-grandfather was on the board to develop that school. He wanted to preserve Chinese heritage for the ones like my father and his siblings, those kids that were born in Seattle. Now, if you ever heard about my father, he was one of the renowned Chinese school mischief makers. But I learned that after going to school all day, so you can sympathize, those of you that are students, you went to school from 9 to 3. Then you had to go to Chinese school every day from 4 to 7. Well, they didn't know about learning differences and styles. And my father, being a boy, he was restless. And so he caused a lot of mischief at the school. When I've met some of these older Chinese men, they find out about my father and they just chuckle because I guess my father had a reputation. I don't know if I should be proud of that. And The other thing that my great grandfather helped to finance and to operate was the 1909 Yukon, Alaska Exposition. That's like the World Fair. Seattle had a World's Fair in 1963, but back at that time, the Transcontinental Railroad was complete. The Northern Pacific Railroad ended in Seattle. And so it was a big promotion of the railroads to come travel cross country. And so my great grandfather, I could find records of all the relatives he sponsored to come over to the US to work at that fair. And it wasn't until 1944 that the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act was rescinded. People think now that the Caucasians were, even though they were threatened, they look down on Chinese because we are hardworking and we tend to be quiet about our circumstances. And so we didn't cause a lot of disruption. That's why I think that this bill to honor the heritage and contribution of Chinese Americans is very good. And I would hope to participate in the curriculum that they're going to establish, because I don't think the schools really know what they should teach. But thank you for listening to me. I'll have more stories another time.